Inside Job, which is a documentary, which I know doesn't doesn't sound like a great feature kickoff, but it's a really, really interesting film, narrated by Matt Damon, and it's a documentary about the recent financial collapse, in which there has been a lot of attention given to the recent financial collapse. Obviously, you know that the story is that Baz Luhrmann is currently remaking The Great Gatsby, and he said that the reason he wanted to do it was, as far as he was concerned, the idea of making The Great Gatsby now in the wake of the financial meltdown somehow kind of made sense, recontextualized the story. That all the good intentions seem to have been blown by the fact that he's announced, on the one hand, it sounds like he's doing it with Leonardo DiCaprio filling the role which was previously filled by Robert Redford, but on the other hand, he has said that he might be doing it in 3D, which really worries me. So, on the good side, Leonardo DiCaprio, Carey Mulligan. On the bad side, do you want to watch Great Gatsby in 3D?
What would be the point?
Well, the only point would be the scene in which she throws all the shirts around and says, "You have so many lovely shirts." So Gatsby's shirts raining down in 3D, but beyond that. But it may have been a bogus news story. Baz Luhrmann just said that he was considering it, and that was the beginning and end of it. Anyway, okay, so on to Inside Job, directed by Charles Ferguson, who says in his director's statement, and this is quite interesting, he says, "The progressive deregulation of the financial sector since the 1980s gave rise to an increasingly criminal industry whose innovations have produced a succession of financial crises. It is my hope that whatever political opinions individual viewers may have, after seeing this film, we can all agree on the importance of restoring honesty and stability to our financial system, and of holding accountable those who destroyed it." So essentially what happens at the beginning of the film, in the pre-credit sequence, in fact, you get a little potted history of Iceland and the Icelandic collapse, which essentially goes from, on the one hand, they have this stable economy, everything's wonderful, everyone's nice to each other, and they're very eco-friendly, and then deregulation comes in and everything falls apart and it's a complete disaster. Then we go through the credit sequence onto then an examination of what happened in America and its repercussions around the world, using microcosm to then illustrate the much wider situation. And essentially the argument of it, which you will have heard to some extent before in
The Guardian?
Well, no, I meant in terms of cinema.
Oh, okay.
I mean, Michael Moore's Capitalism, a Love Story, Enron's Smartest Guys in the Room. Enron's Smartest Guys in the Room was a brilliant documentary which did a thing about trying to explain how it was that a company that appeared to be doing fantastically well suddenly collapsed in upon itself. And I don't have a financial mind, or I did economics at school, but that was about the end of it. But what I really liked about Enron's Smartest Guys in the Room was it managed to convey the mechanics of how this thing happened, how they managed to inflate their worth by measuring their worth in terms of deals that had been done but money that didn't really exist, and you could see how the whole thing got bigger and bigger until a point when it had to collapse, and then suddenly it did. Well, essentially what you get in Inside Job is a depiction of how deregulation of the financial sector, deregulation of the banks, causes everything to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it becomes apparent that the amount of money that exists in hyper-reality is completely unrelated to the money that exists in the real world, and crucially, that this is all built upon debts which people know are going to be defaulted upon, and upon investors investing in debts which they will actually benefit from default happening. But the real ace card up his sleeve is not only does he do the usual stuff, which to some extent, as I said, we have seen before in Michael Moore, is that he turns his attention on the relationship between the financial world, and says, the people who ran companies then ended up being, in government, and everyone's ended up in a top job, but turns his attention on academia and the role that academics have played in producing reports that essentially propped up a system that was bound to fail and getting paid for doing so. Here's a clip.
In 2006, you co-authored a study of Iceland's financial system.
Right.
Iceland is also an advanced country with excellent institutions, low corruption, rule of law. The economy has already adjusted to financial liberalization, while prudential regulation supervision is generally quite strong.
Yeah, and that was the mistake. That turns out that the prudential regulation and supervision was not strong in Iceland, and particularly
during this period. So what led you to think that it was?
I think that you're going with the information you had, and generally the view was that Iceland had very good institutions. It was a very advanced country.
Who told you that? What kind of research did you do?
You talk to people. You have faith in the central bank, which actually did fall down on the job. Clearly,
Why do you have faith in a central bank?
Well, that faith because you go with the information you have.
How much were you paid to write it?
I was paid, I think the number was, it's public information.
And you can hear from that clip, essentially, what you have is an interviewee squirming because they're being asked things, and they're doing that flanneling. Exactly. And there are many interviews. There's one guy that he interviews who, at one point, he becomes really, really cross about the line of questioning and ends up saying, I've been good enough to grant you this interview. And you come in, right, you've got 3 minutes, give it your best shot. And the sight of people being prodded particularly on this particular area. At one point, an academic is asked, look, isn't it significant that people are asked to produce reports that say these things are all fine, but they're paid for saying that they're all fine? He said, no, it's not a problem at all. He said, well, how would it be if a drug company was paid to say that one of their if a drug company paid somebody to say that one of their drugs was fine? Wouldn't the transaction of money be an issue? And he goes, oh, well, I think it turns into Hugh Grant, but obviously an American version of Hugh Grant. And all the way through, there are some great squirming-inducing moments. What you don't have is the kind of the comic grandstanding, the kind of the stunts that, you know, that in the past I think were a problem with Michael Moore's films. Although actually in the case of Capitalism: A Love Story, that was reined in. I mean, the one big stunt in Capitalism: A Love Story was Michael Moore standing outside the banks demanding money back, you know, with a megaphone, which he kind of gets away with it because he's reined it in a little bit. What really works about this film is partly the story is just so horrific. I mean, people start explaining to you the finance, and I'm sure, and we're only scratching the top of it, but it is a horrific story about money being invented out of nowhere and debts which are bound to default, and everyone knowing that this is about to happen, and some people standing up and going, this is about to happen, and then it happening. But more importantly, people who clearly didn't expect to have those questions put to them, people who were clearly brought in because they thought that what they were offering was an expert view, and then finding the interview saying, yes, but actually you guys are implicated in this. I mean, I think obviously, as with any of these things, it's a documentary, and therefore it's not going to have the sort of, you know, the life that a big feature film would have. And personally, I think the role of Matt Damon in it is important, because obviously Matt Damon lending his voice to it means that it has a certain amount of, you know, publicity and a certain amount of cachet that it wouldn't have had otherwise. But I sat there. There was many occasions on which I laughed, many occasions in which I was genuinely appalled. I mean, genuinely shocked. The conclusion is nothing new. It is that all the people that engineered the financial crisis have still got their jobs. They all walked away with their money. They've all, you know, gone into. None of them have lost their houses. Meanwhile, people who really suffered were the people at the bottom end, and it's a very grim and very straightforward picture, which is when you have these kind of financial things, the top end survive. The bottom end are the people who end up, you know, losing their homes, and that is tragic. But there are many laugh out loud moments in Inside Job, just because the sight of people who clearly did not expect to be put on the spot, suddenly being asked tough questions and going, you've got 3 minutes, give it your best shot, was funny and did give a certain sense of payback.
Was it Lenin who said what should be done?
But he went like that
in Russian.
Yes, it's nicht da.
Henry in Liverpool saw Inside Job in New York last October with my daughter Sarah. Film went down well there, as in impact and message felt strongly. Powerful message in the film about why didn't the academic economists alert us to the dangers of a crash
this is it.
coming?
But that's exactly it. And what the film seems to say is they didn't alert them because they had a vested interest in not doing so. There's one wonderful moment in which they're talking about a report that was written called Financial Stability in Iceland. And the guy gets up the CV of the guy who wrote it and says, it's interesting because the report was called Financial Stability in Iceland. On your CV, it's listed as Financial Instability in Iceland. And the guy said, oh, it's a spelling, it's a typo. You go, yeah, it's called revisionist history is what it is.
Right, so that's that done. Will that get a wide distribution, do you think? Will everyone be able to
But it'll get
see
wider than many because it's narrated
it's
by
got
Matt Damon, which is
right.
why I mentioned. I mean, obviously, the world has changed recently. You know, documentaries do end up playing in more places, and we have to thank Michael Moore for that. Whatever my reservations about Michael Moore's grandstanding, he has opened up an area for this stuff to be shown.